Welcome to Filmflix Movie Recap. In this recap, we're going to be reviewing the movie called Frequency. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell icon to get notified when we upload a new video. Let's begin. In October 1969, Frank Sullivan was a dedicated husband and father, working as a New York City firefighter. His wife, Julia, was a nurse at a local hospital, and their 6-year-old son, John, whom Frank affectionately called Little Chief, shared his passion for baseball, particularly the Amazing Mets, and planned to watch the World Series together on television. Frank's best friend was an African-American cop named Satch. John's best friend was a boy named Gordo, who was the same age as him. Apart from his duties as a firefighter and family time, Frank's pastime was operating a ham radio. Fast forward to October 1999, John has become a New York City police officer, with Satch serving as either his supervisor or partner. Gordo is still his best friend, but is now married. John is still living in the family home in Queens, with his mother still working as a nurse nearby. Sadly, Frank passed away 30 years ago while fighting a warehouse fire, which will be commemorated on the upcoming 30th anniversary of his death. The event is a difficult one for John. Julie, Satch, and Gordo are all aware of the emotional impact it has on him. John and Satch are currently preoccupied with a case known as the Nightingale murders, in which a serial killer murdered 3 nurses in 1968 and 1969. Despite extensive investigations, the case remained unsolved for years. However, a new lead emerges when one of the victims' bodies is recently discovered, prompting the reopening of the case. As part of the investigation, John interviews an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Shepard, who live near the crime scene. Mrs. Shepard is a retired nurse, and her son, Jack, was a New York City detective who passed away at a hospital 30 years ago. During a visit from Gordo and his family, they discover Frank's old ham radio, and decide to set it up. After Gordo leaves, John decides to test out the radio, and to his amazement, he manages to contact his father from 30 years in the past, thanks to a peculiar atmospheric phenomenon. Initially, both are skeptical of the conversation's authenticity, with John believing it's a prank by Gordo, and Frank assuming it's someone trying to harm his family, making him furious. As John attempts to convince his father, he shares some crucial information about the upcoming World Series game, which is to be played the following day in Frank's timeline. He also warns him about his imminent death in a warehouse fire, including the name of the warehouse, and explains that following his intuition will result in his demise, but going the other way would save him. Later on, Frank remains doubtful about his conversation with his son from the future, but he can't shake off the feeling of déjà vu when the World Series game unfolds precisely as predicted by the caller. Shortly after, he receives a distress call and rushes to the scene, only to realize that it's the same warehouse where the man claiming to be his son warned him of his death. Trapped on the top floor with no apparent escape route, he recalls John's warning that if he had gone the other way, he would have survived. He takes a chance and changes his path, leading to his safe exit from the inferno. In 1999, John is out drinking with Satch and Gordo, who are attempting to comfort him on the painful 30th anniversary of his father's death. John begins to experience a mix of jumbled memories, including those from his childhood, adolescence, and early days in the police force, with his father present in them all. He expresses his realization that his father didn't perish in a fire, which surprises his friends, as they all know that Frank passed away from lung cancer only 10 years prior, in 1989. John realizes that he has dual memories of his father's death, one where he died in the warehouse fire, and another where he lived for 20 more years, before succumbing to lung cancer. This duality is unique to him, as Satch and Gordo have no recollection of Frank's death in the fire, and remember only his later life. Hey, if you enjoy this video, kindly give us a like and leave a comment below. John contacts his father again that evening and they reconnect. Frank then visits Julia at the hospital where she saves Jack Shepard's life, by catching an error made by the doctor. However, the next day John is plagued by a new set of memories where he attends a funeral with his father, but without his mother, who no longer exists. Meanwhile, the Nightingale case suddenly involves 10 victims instead of 3, and John is shocked to discover that his mother was one of the victims. Julia was the 6th woman to be killed by the Nightingale killer. John informs Frank that Julia passed away 30 years prior and that she shouldn't have been working at the hospital the previous night, implying that her survival was linked to Frank's survival. John urges Frank to stop the Nightingale killer from killing other women, including his mother. Their plan is for Frank to use his foreknowledge of each murder to prevent them and apprehend the killer. John shares with Frank details of the fourth victim, and Frank successfully prevents her death by engaging her in conversation at a bar. Later, John realizes that there were only 9 Nightingale victims in total. John then gives Frank details about the fifth victim, who is also at a bar where Frank is present. While Frank is in the bathroom, Jack Shepherd enters and attacks him. Frank is unaware that Jack is the Nightingale killer and is knocked out, and Jack steals Frank's wallet, including his identification. Upon regaining consciousness, Frank goes to the fifth victim's apartment and discovers her lifeless body. Frank explains the events to John, who then instructs him to hide his wallet in a place where it won't be found for 30 years. John later retrieves the wallet and matches the fingerprints with Jack Shepherd's. However, he keeps the Nightingale killer's true identity a secret from everyone. If Frank had died in the warehouse fire 30 years ago, Julia would have left the hospital and Jack wouldn't have been able to kill more than 3 women. However, since Frank didn't die, Julia stayed at the hospital and saved Jack's life. Despite this, John still wishes that Jack had died at the hospital. During a visit to the Shepherds, John finds out that Mr. Shepherd is alive, but Mrs. Shepherd was killed by the Nightingale killer 30 years ago, making her his last victim. Jack left the police force after being involved in some corruption and is now a private investigator. John tracks down the present-day Jack in a bar and subtly tells him that he's going down 30 years ago. When John reveals to Frank that Jack Shepherd is the Nightingale killer, Satch shows up at Frank's house in 1969 and tells him that his license was found at the fourth victim's apartment. Satch reluctantly arrests Frank for the murder of the fourth victim. In the interrogation room, Satch doesn't believe Frank's story about using his ham radio to contact John in the future until Frank predicts some details of the current 1969 World Series game. Satch leaves Frank in his cell and goes to talk to Julia. Later, Jack enters the interrogation room, and when Satch's partner arrives, Jack leaves with him. Frank plans to electrocute Jack when he returns to the interrogation room. Upon Jack's return, Frank incapacitates him by electrocuting him, causing a power outage in the police station. To cover his tracks, Frank sets a fire, triggering the sprinkler system, and takes Jack's license while everyone evacuates the building. With Jack lying in a puddle of water, and the cell door left open, Frank makes a smooth exit, stealing the file containing evidence against him. Satch doubts Frank's claim that he was communicating with John from the future, using his radio, a belief shared by Julia. However, when the 1969 World Series game goes exactly as Frank predicted, Satch is convinced. Frank breaks into Jack's apartment, where he discovers pictures and jewelry belonging to the Nightingale killer's victims. When Jack returns and attempts to shoot Frank, Frank escapes. Pursued by Jack, Frank runs to the waterfront, where he attempts to drown Jack. Satch and his partner arrive at Jack's apartment and find the pictures and jewelry, but they cannot locate Jack's body at the waterfront. Despite this, Frank, Satch, and others remain convinced that Jack is dead. Upon returning home, Frank contacts John and informs him that Jack is dead, but Julia still died in 1969. Suddenly, a mysterious man knocks out John, who is later revealed to be Jack himself. It appears that in 1969, Jack had figured out that someone in the future had provided Frank with information about the Nightingale murders. Before knocking out John, Jack also realized that Frank's wife had given birth to John, and that he had provided the information to Frank. After handcuffing and holding Frank at gunpoint, Jack throws away John's gun. When John regains consciousness, he wrestles Jack. In the meantime, Jack sneaks into Julia's room and tries to strangle her. Upon awakening, Frank hears Julia's voice and realizes that Jack is still alive. Frank manages to free himself and grabs his shotgun. However, he sees that Jack is holding John hostage and demands that Frank drop his weapon, in exchange for his son's safety. After grabbing John's gun, Jack is poised to kill him, but Frank surrenders his shotgun. In a split second, Julia tackles Jack, and he releases John, pushing Julia to the ground. Frank then retrieves his shotgun and shoots off Jack's right hand. Jack flees Frank's house, but as he tries to choke John with his right hand, it begins to disappear. Backing away in horror, Jack continues to hold John at gunpoint. Frank aims his shotgun at Jack, who is about to shoot him, but Frank shoots Jack in self-defense, killing him. Father and son, Frank and John, are finally reunited in 1999. John realizes that Frank is alive because he quit smoking 30 years ago. The movie concludes with John and Frank playing baseball, while Julia watches. Thanks to Frank's decision to quit smoking, John's girlfriend did not break up with him, and they have a son. And that's all for this recap. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.